Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is TB Sky, and my voice is shaky because I've been coughing all day, and we are going to talk about comic strips and webcomics, specifically how to write them and how not to draw them. What you got on the screen in front of you right now is the latest, as of the recording of this video, Penny Arcade comic. If you're not familiar with Penny Arcade, don't worry. You don't really need to be in order to get something out of this video, but if you are, well, perhaps you'll understand a little better some of the things I'm going to be talking about. Nonetheless, this comic, upon its release, generated a fair amount of criticism on Twitter and in the comics sphere because people largely disagreed with what it had to say. They didn't like what the writing was trying to tell them. I looked at the comic and I found a different reason to criticize them. I looked at the artwork and found it completely perfunctory, because this is a textbook example of the talking head comic, and that's going to be the subject of the video. Today we're going to examine talking head comics. We're going to talk about why they might be bad and what you can do to avoid making them. But before we do this, Penny Arcade doesn't need my help and doesn't need my scorn. And what I mean by that is that Penny Arcade is perhaps one of the most successful webcomics of all time, spawning a multinational multimedia empire of videos and merchandise and incredibly successful conventions, one of which I would love to go to someday. They're gonna be fine. I'm not here to try and tell them how to be successful. I'm not here thinking from atop my giant throne of 7,000 subscribers that I am the guy who knows what they need to do in order to be successful. No. And I don't imagine that my criticism will matter that much to them, but hopefully it'll be helpful to some of you. And they don't care that I'm doing this. They don't care that I'm criticizing them. If you like Penny Arcade, it's fine. I enjoy it too much of the time. It's fine. Don't feel attacked. This is not about calling something bad or awful. It's about talking about some of the flaws that are there and talking about how to recognize them and how to avoid them, okay? So just don't be an asshole in the comments is what I'm trying to say. So, let's talk about the problem with talking heads. And in order to illustrate the problem with talking heads, I'm going to call in some assistance from another comic strip, Garfield. Garfield is awful. It's just awful. And again, if you like it, that's fine. Good on you. I'm not here to, criticize your life decisions, but Garfield is awful. It is very, very bad. It is very, very boring. It is extremely lazy, low effort, tripe being shoveled out on a daily basis by assembly line with nothing interesting or creative to say and no reason to exist except to perpetuate a soulless merchandising empire. Anyway, that's not really why I'm bringing Garfield up, because one of the reasons why Garfield is bad is because it is the very worst example of a talking head webcomic. And when you look at Garfield Comics, you can kind of identify what I mean by that, because any given Garfield comic, like with the very rare exception of a Sunday comic when sometimes an artist gets to draw people doing stuff, Garfield Comics look like this. 3 panels with some dialogue bubbles in them and absolutely fuck all happening. There's a joke there, sure, sort of, being delivered entirely by dialogue, which is attached to one of the talking heads on the page, but it doesn't really matter. This first comic here, let's do something. Okay, I have an idea. Any suggestions? Let's not do something. Garfield is lazy. Yay. I could replace Garfield and John in this comic with literally anything else in the entire universe, and I would probably improve the comic. If I replaced them with a tree and a rock, the comic would be substantially funnier. If I replaced them with any other 2 comic characters from any other property in the entire universe, honestly, the comic would probably be more interesting to look at, but most of all, it is... oh god, it's so bad. It's so boring and lazy. I kind of want to just rant about Garfield now, but I'm gonna try and stick to the point. One of the problems with what's going on here is that the art and the writing are entirely divorced from each other. That is to say, like I said, I could replace John and Garfield with literally anything else in this comic, and it would still work because the entire joke, everything that the comic is about, everything it's trying to say, everything it's trying to deliver exists as text. And that's the point where you kind of have to ask, but if the whole thing just exists as a joke in text boxes, then why the hell do you need any artwork? Why make a comic at all? And the same thing goes for this one down here. Tonight on Cooking with Dracula, something special for those chilly fall days. Cream und neck soup. Cream of neck soup. Wow, that's a big blender. That's Dracula on TV cooking stuff. Good lord. Again, Garfield doesn't need to be there. It doesn't need to be a thing. And so you could just divorce it from the artwork entirely and would make zero difference. There are comics out there called there's one called Garfield minus Garfield, where Garfield does not show up in any of the Garfield comics, and every single one of them is funnier for it because the artwork doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It has no connection to anything going on. You could remove it, you could change it. Nothing matters, nothing changes. This is one of the big problems of the Talking Head comic, is that they have no reason to be a comic at all. So let's go back to Penny Arcade. When you go back through the archives of Penny Arcade, if you just kind of start clicking back for a while, what you'll find is that rather a lot of the Penny Arcade comics are somewhere on the spectrum of the Talking Head comic. One of the most egregious examples is this one right here, which is 3 panels of mostly copy-pasted artwork delivering everything that the comic is trying to say entirely in speech bubbles, with little to absolutely no interaction with the artwork. The artwork is merely there to exist as a vessel to deliver the joke in the writing. And if you look at Garfield, and you look at that Penny Arcade comic, the artwork in Penny Arcade is a lot nicer, more interesting, better to look at, but in execution and style, it's really not that different. Same thing goes for these comics. Same thing goes for these comics. And I could find dozens, if not maybe hundreds more examples of comics in the same vein, and they would have the same problem, that the writing and the artwork doesn't really match up or interact meaningfully. I could replace them with other characters, I could replace them with inanimate objects, I could take away the artwork entirely, and most of these comics, to some extent, would still work because everything about them exists in text, in the text bubbles. And that's really boring. That's the fundamental issue. Visually, it's really boring. There's no reason for the artwork to be there. It doesn't add anything. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't change anything. It's not interesting. It's a talking head comic. You could replace everything that's going on with a talking head or a couple of talking heads, and you would get exactly the same effect. So that's the trouble with talking head comics. But what's the opposite of that? What's the anti-talking head comic? What's the thing that is better? What's the thing to aim for? Well, there isn't, as far as I'm aware, a specific term for the opposite of a talking head comic, so I've invented one, which is a synthesis comic. And I call it a synthesis comic because a synthesis comic is a comic where the writing, the words, and the action displayed in the artwork work together to deliver the punchline, where one cannot work or exist without the other. One of the prime examples, because Penny Arcade gets this right sometimes too, like especially when they do comics in universe in some video game, they tend to get this right and do it, in fact, very, very well. Look at this comic, for instance. 2 goat men, a father and a son, contemplating the goat drum that they have made. And the father is speaking in a sort of heightened, very humanistic language that implies that he not only does he have human-like emotions and feelings and aspirations for his child, he also has a culture that is complex and many-faceted and which might deserve some understanding and preservation, because they only make these drums because they hope to bring summer back. Like this poignant little scene, undercut with the punchline, which is the monk coming in and smashing the drum because there might be some gold in it. It's a joke on the callousness of game mechanics and the kind of monster that playing video games will often, like the kind of monster video games will often ask you to be, with no consideration for anything else. And it's also playing with the idea that, you know, it's kind of weird and freaky and funny when goatmen from hell turn out to have humanistic aspirations and ideals and emotions. That's a funny juxtaposition. But the point is, if you take away the writing from this comic, it doesn't make even a little bit of sense. Like, maybe you can intuit some of it, but no, it doesn't make sense at all. The artwork would cease to have any reasoning to it at all. And by the same token, if you took away the artwork, the dialogue would make no sense without these specific goatmen, without the context of Diablo as an aesthetic universe, without the character coming in, doesn't have to be a monk, but without the hero character coming in at the end and smashing the drum, the comic wouldn't work. So there is synthesis. The art and the writing are cooperating to deliver the point. The same thing goes for the comic down here. The same thing goes for these two comics. They don't work unless you deliver the point with the artwork. And it doesn't always have to be the high concept in-game or extreme scenarios. Sometimes it could be very mundane. This comic, for instance, which I don't find it very funny, but the concept and the execution works perfectly. What's going on here is that in the dialogue, the characters are talking about mundane family shit and some aspect of their businesses on the side. And they're sitting around eating pizza, and the joke, the humor, is derived from the punchline where, oh, right, Skyrim, they keep trying to make us buy Skyrim, but also the weird and dark implications of some of the stuff that is said between the two characters, juxtaposed with the utter mundanity of the two guys just sitting around eating pizza. Right? That's the joke, the weirdness of the stuff they're talking about, as opposed to the absolute normalcy of the stuff that's going on. The artwork and the writing are not so closely interlinked that you couldn't separate them, but they work together in synthesis. They both deliver part of the humor. Like, it's, if you didn't have this highly mundane, boring setting, I don't think the absurdity of the writing would land quite as well. Same thing goes for this comic, which is one of the better comics I think that Penny Arcade has done recently, where Gabe becomes so infatuated with Battle Chases, the video game, that he's standing out in the rain like some sort of religious lunatic trying to hand out flyers and convert people to his newfound cult. And the visuals with the rain and the nice old lady and the loneliness and the muted color palette and everything about it works together in order to deliver the pathos of the writing. So there's an interplay, there's a connection between what's written and what's going on the page. There is synthesis. But one of the greatest examples, perhaps ever, of synthesis between writing and action is Calvin and Hobbes. This is my favorite syndicated newspaper-style comic strip of all time, and one of the big reasons why is because Watterson was an absolute, and still is perhaps, and probably an absolute master at making the writing and the art work together to deliver the point. And he has a number of tricks that he dips into in order to deliver a comic where the humor is almost entirely in the writing, but it is supported and interwoven with the artwork in a way that makes it a holistic whole. Like, it makes it a whole thing where everything about the comic is necessary to deliver its points. Because when you look at Calvin and Hobbes comics, they are largely dialogue driven. Like, it's rare, with a few exceptions, but mostly rare, that you get a comic in Calvin and Hobbes that is not, to some extent, if not primarily, driven by dialogue, with a joke delivered in the writing. So what does Watterson do in order to make it work better? Well, one of the tricks he likes to do is he likes to move the characters through a sequence of events while the writing does its thing. Take, for example, the comic up here. This is part of a longer storyline where Calvin has convinced himself that because winter is coming and the days are getting shorter, that means the sun is dying and everybody's going to die, right? So the characters are talking about how Calvin is going to live his life like he has no regrets, and then the punchline, the undercutting of his lofty ideals is that he's going to spend his time sitting in his room, eating snacks and reading comic books, right? It would be extremely easy to deliver exactly the same joke by having the characters already sitting on the floor in the room with some comic books and eating snacks. It would be incredibly easy to do that and just have two talking heads in a series of comic panels that don't change, deliver exactly the same dialogue to exactly the same effect. Except it wouldn't really be exactly the same effect, because what's happening here is, notice how here we are outside. The two Hobbes is talking to Calvin. Here they are entering the house as Calvin is talking to Hobbes. Here Calvin has taken off his jacket. They're clearly inside, but they're not yet in his room. And here finally they get to his room where they engage in the mundane activity that undercuts his lofty ambitions, right? And this is all very basic stuff, but what's happened is we have interesting visuals that work to ground us in the reality that Calvin is an ordinary 6-year-old boy doing ordinary 6-year-old boy things. He plays around outside, he has to go home, he has to go through the door, he has to take off his clothes, and then he can go up to his room and do his thing. And this is something that he does multiple times if you look, for instance, at the comic down here. Once again, it's part of a longer storyline where Calvin was being bullied, but somehow he managed to scare off the bully by using Hobbes as a defensive shield. Doesn't really matter. Look at what the artwork is doing. All of the joke is up here in the writing, and much of the joke only works if you have read the previous comics in the series of comics that this is a bookend to, by the way. But look at what the artwork is doing. First, Calvin comes home. He comes through the door. Then we get a look from the perspective of his mother looking down on him on the floor, as we are reminded that he's tiny. He's a small child. That's a countertop just to show us for scale. Here, the door and the dresser shows us the scale of Calvin's smallness, the fact that he is a small child. Here he walks away proudly, and here we zoom up to his mother leaning on the countertop, reinforcing the normalness and the domesticity of it all in order to play up the difference that is always at the heart of Calvin and Hobbes, the difference in scale between Calvin's grand imagination and self-aggrandizing behavior and lofty thoughts about himself and his world, and the absolute normality of the world that he actually lives in. This is the source of much of the comic's humor. But this is one of Watterson's tricks. When he has something that's, from a writing perspective, like all of it is in the writing, there really isn't much you can do to do interesting visuals. Well, he'll move a character through an environment, through some sort of sequence that grounds things in reality, that reminds us that we're dealing with an ordinary 6-year-old boy. And that's why a lot of Calvin and Hobbes is funny. Another prime thing that he likes to do is he likes to jump into Calvin's imagination. Excuse me, it's that shaky voice coming back to haunt me. Here, Calvin is imagining himself as Spaceman Spiff. Being hunted by aliens, he rounds back on them and finds that no matter how much he tries to fire all of his weapons, absolutely nothing is working. Cut to the classroom, where he's desperately shouting out random facts at his teacher, who has now realized that Calvin has not been paying attention the entire lesson, and the boy is desperately trying to save his ass by just throwing out whatever will work. The brilliance of this comic, and it's a mundane thing, it's not high-level analysis I'm providing you here, but the brilliance of this comic is that the artwork and the writing are entirely dependent on each other. The punchline doesn't land without the artwork. Even though there's so much text, so much writing, it doesn't land without the artwork. And the reason is, the punchline here is that Calvin is in class in the most mundane of settings possible, trying desperately to save his own ass from a scolding by pretending like he was paying attention, by throwing out random facts and hoping one of them sticks. But the reason that's funny is because he's been imagining himself in this heightened space opera, chased by aliens in some dramatic life and death scenario. He rounds on them for a last stand, tries to fire, but nothing is working. I'm firing the Myrtleizer beam, I'm firing the phosphoro bombs, I'm firing the mortar blasters. Nothing is working! And then we cut to the final panel where we see that what his imagination is doing is transforming the ordinary scenario into this weird comic book scene, right? And that punchline, if it had just been Calvin in class without the artwork of him as Spaceman Spiff, but imagining like exactly the same dialogue in thought bubbles, where we could see maybe he had weird expressions on his face or something, where he was imagining being Spaceman Spiff, but it was just Calvin sitting there with thought bubbles saying exactly the same lines of dialogue, the joke wouldn't have landed at the end because the setup would have been clear. We would have already known, oh, he's just in class being bored, imagining himself as a spaceman, and then that transitions into him shouting at his teacher, I guess, or something. Like, that would have been extremely boring, but because the artwork is so heightened, because the drama is so intense in the artwork, that juxtaposition makes it funny, makes it interesting. And I could talk about Calvin and Hobbes for hours. By the way, I'm going to try and end this video before half an hour. But this is the brilliance of Calvin and Hobbes. The same thing goes for the Tornado comic right here. It's exactly the same narrative trick that he's pulling off, where he makes the artwork utterly indispensable to delivering the punchline. And the punchline is Calvin's room is really messy, because he's a messy boy who, you know, plays around and gets in trouble. And it's the normality, it's the ordinary reality of Calvin that makes it funny. The same thing goes for here. This one I like in particular because Watterson is pulling off another clever little visual trick. Again, he's doing that heightened dramatic narration of the play in Calvin's imagination as it happens. And then we cut to the normal world and we see Calvin making an absolute mess because he's a messy little boy. And his mother delivering the punchline by going, "You better not be splashing in there," while the entire floor is already an ocean. But the clever thing that Watterson is doing here visually is that as the whale in this panel breaches, flies up through the air, we cut to the next panel and we see Calvin in exactly the same orientation, doing the same motion from the same perspective. And that visual coherence between the whale and Calvin reinforces that he's imagining himself to be this beast. And it's such a beautiful bit of visual storytelling to sell the point, to land it. It's wonderful to behold. I consider, as you can probably figure out by now, I consider Calvin and Hobbes one of the greatest examples of how to weave the writing and the artwork together, even when it comes to short little 4 or 3 panel comics in a newspaper, syndicated, published every single day. There are so many things you can do to make the artwork and the writing work together to deliver the joke, to deliver the point, to deliver the thing you're trying to get out. And it doesn't have to be this. It doesn't have to be a talking head doing nothing with writing that doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be this. It doesn't have to be any of these. It can look like this instead. And just, again, I don't want this to come across as me just kind of shitting on Penny Arcade, because Penny Arcade, and particularly the artist Mike Krahulik, is in fact a rather fantastic artist. There are side projects like Automata, or which just the artwork on Automata is absolutely gorgeous. It works like gangbusters. I love the visual universe they've got here. I love the visual storytelling that they do in these comics. And comics like Nightlight, which is just a fantastic little concept, where Krahulik really gets to show off how good of an artist he can really be when he's allowed to let loose. Penny Arcade is run by in fact, sometimes a fantastic artist and a perfectly decent writer who sometimes manages to be brilliant. It's just that in their day-to-day operations, in the bread and butter work that most of their business is built around, sometimes they fall back on things that are lazy, things that could be done a lot better, things that perhaps should be done a lot better. But like I said at the start, they don't need my help, they don't need my scorn. But if you are thinking about doing your own comic, if you're thinking about creating a webcomic of some kind or a strip, keep some of this in mind. And remember that even if all of your jokes and all of your action happens in the dialogue, there are things you can do with the artwork to sell it, to tie it together to make it work. Anyway, my name has been TV Skyen. This has been a long, rambly video about the technicalities of making comics and comic strips. If you liked it, there is a like button. If you hated it, there's a dislike button as well, or rather, if you hated it, you haven't really watched this far. You should leave a comment down below if you have a question or something you want to say or something you want to ask. I try to read all of my comments. I try to respond to as many of my comments as I feel like I have a useful response to. And I guess at this point, all that's left to say is that I will see you next time.